What's up everybody, welcome to another Flutter video, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I'm just going to give 5 pieces of advice when programming, because every time I do, say, a programming subject at uni or I see other people programming, I see so many things that could be improved on when programming, and it doesn't have to do with stuff like technical skills or specifically like not being able to perform a task, just basic programming habits that you should get used to and really be able to um, implement into your programming applications, or at least the whole process of it. So the first bit of advice I'd like to keep, and you've probably heard this many times before, is keep it simple, right? Because I always see this. I always see this. Code can become complicated. Sometimes it can be really complicated. Like I see people trying to implement something like maybe, let's say, a searching algorithm, right? And let's say they decide to use a bunch of loops rather than recursive function or something, and they tend to overcomplicate it. Maybe have 2 or 3 different counters when you only need just the one, or maybe even incorporate variables that you don't even need at all, or maybe not utilizing arrays, which does keep things a lot more simple, as opposed to something like, let's say, lists or other really complicated structures. So it's important to keep things simple, but that doesn't necessarily mean cutting things off. Like if you have to implement something such as a list, um, and you're thinking, well, an array is more simpler, so why can't I implement that? Because sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you might want to store data, let's say, of a specific type or maybe different types, and you'd find a list to be more easier to implement than an array. Because for an array, you won't have just the one array. You'll have an array of pointers pointing to more arrays. That just doesn't work, right? It's important to keep things simple, and it doesn't just have to be with regards to data structures. It could be just your whole program itself. Like, you might have a whole bunch of variables that you only use once throughout the program. Trying to find ways of simplifying it, maybe reducing the lines of code, is really important. That's the first piece of advice. Make sure to keep things simple, not to overcomplicate it. And usually what helps is just being able to write down on a sheet of paper or type up exactly what you're going to do to start things off. Like maybe you might think about how, let's say you're trying to implement a scanning out something that scans from a file. Best thing to start off with is maybe writing down or doing a little diagram as to what exactly it's scanning, how's it going to store it, where it's going to store it, what's going to do with it afterwards. Just things like this is it's important to think about before actually implementing it into your code. And so that's my first advice. Make sure to keep things simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Throughout our tutorial series and our workshops, we do try to keep things as simple as possible so that not only that we can understand it, but also, let's say you're working on a project. You have multiple group members. It's important to keep it simple so that everyone else, let's say you're passing this on to someone else to do over a certain time frame, they can understand what it is that you're doing. And number one's going to follow up with another important piece of advice, which I'll get to later on. Okay, so first thing is make sure to keep your code, your program, your solution simple yet effective and, in a sense, efficient, but keep it simple and effective. Make sure it does all the things that you need to do, but it's not complex, it's not complicated, right? And so the second piece of advice that I like to give is make use of the resources given to you, right? Sometimes you get stuck. Sometimes you get stuck genuinely when programming or even just trying to identify a solution. You do get stuck, right? You get stuck on actually what to do. And there are a lot of resources that you can utilize. Specifically for Flutter, you've got the flutter.dev page, and you've also got the pub.dev page, which contains a bunch of different packages, examples, descriptions. You've also got YouTube videos out there, such as our workshops, as well as other YouTube videos out there that go over how to create a simple app in Flutter, or maybe go over the more technical details. maybe go over the theory. How do certain widgets actually work, right? And that might help you understand exactly what to do when you're creating your app. So definitely make use of the resources to given to you. Google's a big one, any search engine. Um, in addition to all this, you got YouTube, you got tutorials, you got actual courses on Udemy. If you're a person who loves to do courses, short courses, definitely, so definitely things like Udemy or even Code Academy is another really cool one. Are really good resources for being able to learn a specific programming language or just programming in general, maybe the theory behind it. So make sure that you use the resources given to you. And that does also help you to keep things simple as well. Maybe you'll see something that you can implement and make your code much more simpler, right? All of these pieces of advice play hand in hand. So, the third piece of advice is sometimes it is best to start off with a design. I spelled off wrong. Okay, actually, I might change this. It is best to start off with a design. I think I can get rid of sometimes, because if you know what you're going to be doing, if you know what your program looks like, if you know at least the basics of what your program is going to do, it made things so much easier. It makes it so much easier for you to be able to implement it with code, right? And if you kind of pair this up with make use of the resources given to you, right? It not only makes things more simpler, it makes things more quicker as well. When you start off with a design, this applies for programming, this applies for everything else, even engineering, everything else. Like even I gave this example before, but even Lego. Like if you take a bunch of bricks, right, and you're asked to create, let's say, a Star Wars ship, right? All the pieces are there, but there's nothing to follow. There's no set of instructions, no design. You don't know where to start, right? Sometimes you're able to do it, but you're only able to do it because you have a rough idea of what it's going to look like, and kind of you understand what is necessary, what isn't. Like, yeah, I don't need these pieces. Just like that, when you're designing a solution, when you're designing a program, it's important to think about what it is that your program's going to do. What are the requirements? What is the essentially the scope of your program or project? So when you start off with a design, it doesn't have to be specifically hand-drawn drawings, or doesn't have to be a flowchart, doesn't have to be a really formal report on how you conducted your research and then design things. It could be something as simple as just trying to jot down, oh, it's supposed to do this and that. Just starting off with something that allows you to identify what your program does, maybe how it does it as well, makes things a lot easier when you're implementing it, right? Going straight to the code doesn't always help. In fact, majority of the time, if not all the time, you need to start off with some form of design for your project. All right, so now the fourth bit of advice is something I see way too often, right? And that is commenting. This is more specific for programming. So what I'm doing here, I'm essentially creating a comment, right? Let's say you're completely new to Flutter, you're completely new to programming, let's say, but you want to learn programming and you start off with Flutter. And I'm running a tutorial, I'm doing something similar, and then I start by going, okay, we're going to import package Flutter material dot dot. Okay, you guys understand? Right, okay, let's move on. Like, no one probably understands. Absolutely no one understands, because what is this? I'm new to programming. I can guess what import is, but what the hell is this? What is package? Like, I can guess, but what is Flutter? Like, what was this? Like, what is Dart? I want to learn Flutter, not Dart. Like, when you're a new programmer, when you're someone who's looking at someone else's code, your mind starts to think about what's going on, right? It wants to know what's going on in order to understand it and actually do something with it. And so let's say I'm conducting this tutorial again, This time around, I'll put some comments. I say, you can make the comments as, like, the comments just have to be able to explain what some of the code does, right? It could be a line of code, could be a block of code. In this case, this line of code grabs a package that allows us to create widgets and components of the application, right? Makes sense, right? If I did this tutorial again and this time I had this comment up the top, the person reading this, the person following along can say, okay, oh, this line of code grabs a package there. Okay, I think it makes sense. Like, you get to an extent, right? You're brand new to programming. Obviously you have to explain, like, why is this blue? Why is this orange? Why? What's the point of this? But in general, you understand what this gibberish does, right? Like, when you're new to programming, like, most of the stuff is just gibberish, right? It's just something you don't understand. But when you have comments like this with proper English or some language that you can understand, it makes it a lot easier. Like, now I know that this grabs something called a package, and this will allow us to actually build an app, right? That's what I'm getting from this. And sometimes, or a lot of times, I see a lot of people programming, writing a bunch of code, and there's barely any comments. And in fact, the comments that they do write are pretty useless. Like, sometimes they're good. Like, sometimes it's like to do, right? Like, if you've seen this before, essentially it means do something, right? And sometimes in the program or a software, or when someone shows their code, they do have these to-dos, and it's important. It's really good. But then they have all this other code, right? Some functions or some classes or even widgets in Flutter that I've never seen before. And I'm just sitting there trying to understand, what does it do? What does it do? I can't mind read, right? I can't do any mind reading thing with the software. Like, I can't even read other people's mind, right? So it makes it a lot more difficult to understand what this code does. Like, if I have something like, I don't know, if I equals 10 mod 3, then I don't know, do something. If I gave this to someone, let's say this is some messed up code. Like, let's say it's this if is actually just another function. Just an example. Let's say this is a complex function, right? It's a function that not many people have seen before. And if I show this to, let's say, my friend or someone else doing programming, they gotta know what it does, right? And let's say I just send this to them. I don't actually sit next to them and explain what's going on, right? It's important to have comments there, because it's kind of like the person who built the script is sitting there next to you, and he's saying, yeah, this bit does this and this bit does that. There's nothing there. You have no clue what's going on, and sometimes you lose motivation. Like, you can't be bothered reading everything. So it's really important to have commenting, and appropriate commenting as well. Sometimes too much commenting is bad as well. You don't need to comment every single line. Like, if I create an integer, like I is equal to 0, this line of code is pretty straightforward, right? I could look at this and say, well, I is assigned the value of 0, right? Like, someone else might say I equals 0. Well, that's not exactly what it means, but at least they get the general picture, right? You don't need to comment on this. You don't need to comment like I is assigned. Like, if you do this for every single line of code, it's just unnecessary commenting. So it's important to make sure that when you are commenting, you do it right. So make sure not to comment too much. Make sure to comment, though. Don't comment on things that are obvious. Comment on processes as well. Like, for instance, if you have a block of code, you've got comments throughout the whole thing, but maybe you don't have a comment for the function itself. Like, you don't know what the function does. Like, you do know what it does inside the function itself, but what is it actually used for? Sometimes you might be calling this function somewhere else, but you won't have a comment for that. So it's important to make sure that, in a sense, the comments follow the code. It flows, right? Makes it a lot easier to understand what the program does in addition to those specific blocks of code. And finally, last bit of advice, pretty obvious, keep programming. If you want to learn programming, if you want to keep on programming, if you want to get better at programming, practice makes progress, right? The more you practice, the more you essentially try out new things, explore, try a few YouTube tutorials, try a few courses here and there, maybe get your friends to help you out. And if you are doing a programming subject, take it to heart. Like, programming's fun. Yeah. We all love programming. So keep programming and keep enjoying what you're doing, and you'll find yourself being a better programmer at the end. And it takes a while. Like, there's no rule for how long it takes before you become a professional programmer. And what defines a professional programmer, right? You may be someone who's excellent at designing things, but maybe not programming, like maybe not actually implementing it. But once again, all of these things tie in together. Keeping things simple, right? Make sure to keep things simple, and you can do that by making use of the resources given to you. And maybe you can keep it simple by starting off with a design. Because when you start with design, you have a clear picture of what your program's going to do. Now, if you are working on a project, a hackathon, or something similar, and you want to share some code with your friends, commenting is important because it keeps things simple for them, lets them understand. Like, if there's a line of code that seems very complex, commenting can help simplify it, right? And keep on programming, keep on practicing with the resources given to you. Try using different designs. Like, you can see how all of these things come together, right? So these are my 5 pieces of advice when programming, and these are some advice that we're going to take into heart when we run our tutorials and workshops. So once again, hope you guys had a great time, and I'll catch you guys later. Make sure to like and subscribe the channel, and check out our other videos as well.